Hello, beautiful community. Can you see me? And can you hear me? Because if you can see and hear, we're going to jump into a casual little chat for a while because we haven't seen each other as often as we would like in recent times. Let's have a look. Let's have a look. So it looks like you're seeing and hearing me. Is that right? Is that right, beautiful community? Yep. Brilliant. Okay, let's have a look at questions. My health is not as good as I would like at the moment, so I'm going to be slower, and this is going to be maybe gentler, as though you're talking to me not while I'm in my chair, but somewhere between the chair and the bed. But you and I are intimate enough in our relationship to be able to deal with a slower conversation, and this may last for a while, given my health at the moment and some of the medical things I need to do. Sally is asking, why were many countries like the UK, France, and US able to rush to the defense of Israel yesterday using their own jets, but not able to defend Ukraine from missile attacks over 2 years? Well, I'm not here to talk about anything technical or physical, so I'm not going to talk about, what would be the case if Russia were firing weapons at Ukraine across friendly country territories, or how much neutral water, how many Russian weapons fly over to get to Ukraine, and so on. So none of that is for me. I think that Israel is a more important ally of the United States than Ukraine. That's a certain kind of historical fact. That's not necessarily because of the Biden administration having fond views of Israel's current government. It's because of various factors in US understanding of its strategic interests and in US forces in domestic politics. Should Ukraine be as great or greater a strategic interest for the United States as Israel is in 2024? Well, you know my views. Not only do I think that Ukraine is arguably a maximally great strategic interest for the United States, but I also don't separate these stories. I don't separate entirely what Iran is doing in the Middle East from what Russia is doing in Ukraine, from what China may or may not do in the years to come. We are talking about a collapsing global order about which I've made a video on the main channel, which is one I really stand by and recommend, even though the music is really loud there. And the challenge we face in Ukraine is basically a kind of semi-alliance between Russia and, just making sure you're hearing me still, Russia and China changing borders in Europe by force, and us not being able to stop that. So We have to be realistic about the agents that are involved, however. So we have certain assumptions we make about Putin's imperial project, how it's going to eat itself up. Well, there are assumptions we can make about the US as a superpower, as an empire, however you call it. And that is that it is in a pattern of withdrawal from the world. And what is interesting about the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia is that the West's response to it eventually turned out to be a kind of exception, an exception to US withdrawal from the world. Now, that's how I see it. And at the moment, there are some positive patterns, but there are also some negative patterns in terms of where that conflict is going. We're not heading in a pretty direction. We may not be heading in a certain one kind of a formalized partition of Ukraine, but we may well be heading for some kind of um, partition of Ukraine with disputed territories on current going. But that could change because anything can happen in war and politics. So Ukraine is really a case of US power doing something exceptional while the tendency is for it to go in the other direction, to withdraw. And, even when we're talking about wanting an action that aligns with a kind of tendency, here we're talking about wanting an action that goes against the tendency. But even when we talk about actions that go together with a tendency, for instance, I don't know, the Marshall Plan, when there were many forces in US politics pushing it to do something like that because of economic considerations, strategic considerations, and various alignment of forces in domestic politics, and also just the right individuals being in the right places. But, so even when there is a tendency that it makes sense for something to happen, it still often takes a lot of luck and contingency for it to come through. So, keeping Putin out, making Putin lose, even when if the tendencies were more preferential in the global context, it would have still required quite a bit of contingency, quite a bit of democratic consolidation to pull it off. So these are some thoughts about this, but you know that my analysis is that if we were to abstract away the causes of US withdrawal, which are largely about democratic incapacity at home, then the case for Ukraine being a very important strategic interest for the United States would really, really be very strong. And that's really how I think about it. I don't see it in terms of humanitarian or ethical disparities. There's plenty of things going on in the world that are terrible that the United States won't even think twice about stopping. So we're talking about US interests, and as you know, my view is quite strong about the weight of US interests in that place. But at the same time, we're kind of asking, a mountain lion that isn't a tiger anymore, which it used to be in a past life, to act like it's a tiger, and it's just not going to do that. But we can always make it a few inches extra in the direction in which we want it to go. By the way, Caesar's is the next question. But by the way, the only thing I would add is that I still share the analysis that any kind of partition of Ukraine would be a platform for Putin to gain some kind of control over the country's entire politics. Caesar is asking, Um, I asked myself lately if the interdependence of dictators or democracies has better chances to survive. I tried to avoid my favorite cliches about this and couldn't crack it. Caesar, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by this, but if you're talking about the way dictatorships keep each other afloat and the way democracies keep each other afloat, I think it's a really important question, if I get you, if that's what it is. I think that with democracies, we've got to be aware that while there are mechanisms that keep democracies afloat, there are also mechanisms occurring between democracies that can sink them. And we've just been talking about a fairly good example of that. If the US supports Ukraine more, that will be a help toward the sustenance of European, West European, indeed, democracies over the couple of decades to come. If the US lets Putin have a limited win in Ukraine, that will hurt European democracy. That's that kind of interesting interdependence. As far as democracies are concerned, I do think the United States is absolutely central. I think that terrible things happening to US democracy would sink many European democracies, actually, in a kind of domino effect. There'd be a real risk of that. There'd be less of a risk the other way around. In other words, if France became what Hungary is today in 2040, that's not necessarily going to topple US democracy. And so, just like Ukraine in a much more immediate and visceral way is dependent on US domestic politics, so folks in Europe are also dependent on US domestic politics. Now, one of the problems, of course, with making this distinction between how democracies and how authoritarian regimes keep each other afloat is that a lot of the political patterns that you see in authoritarian regimes are creeping into democratic life, not just because authoritarian regimes are inserting it into our life, but much more importantly, because they're organically arising in our political life, in our democratic life. And we have this bizarre pattern now of many political forces in our democracies using democracy to try to end democracy. So there's much more to say about than this, but what I would say is that there is certainly a connection in the particular case of Ukraine between what happens there and how much of a boost we get versus what I've called the Russo-Chinese semi-alliance gets. So one of the things that history is weighing up for us here is who's going to get the boost and who's going to get the deflation. But this is also a chicken and egg situation. I mean, we would benefit from helping Ukraine, and that would make us struggle less. But because we are struggling, we're not able to help Ukraine more. Rachel is asking, do I think Russia's economic strength while at war and under sanctions will challenge international economic norms going into the future? You may be pushing me a bit beyond what I'm entitled to comment on. I have always been a skeptic about the efficacy of sanctions. I'm also a skeptic about sort of diving into depth about whether each sanction is constructive or not, because sometimes sanctions are just things you do because there's nothing else you can do. And so much of the sanctions response by the West against Russia is in that mode. We're doing this because we're not doing other things, or we can't do other things, we're not prepared to do other things. At the moment, the Russians feel that they have an industrial and a military edge. Western experts would be pointing out that they may be on course to lose it a couple of years from now, but the Russians in response are pointing out that we may experience unprecedented democratic decline by then. And the Russians are unduly optimistic about that, I feel, but we do have that pattern. And if that decline happens, then there won't be this sort of dramatic rebalancing with the Russians then struggling industrially. And of course, the Russians are hugely struggling with wanting to demobilize and mobilize their society politically and militarily at the same time. I don't know what I can say about challenging economic norms, but you can ask me again, I'm sure, on maybe on Twitter, and I'll have a go at saying what I think. Horace Norris, Vlad, any thoughts on why commentary from Western political leaders and media outlets on Iran's attack seems to omit or downplay the fact that it was in response to an attack on a consulate? Well, I'm not sure what I have to say about various leaders commentating on it. They're just going to say what is part of what they need to say, given whatever relationship they have to that conflict. As far as media outlets, the ones I saw called it a retaliatory strike. The BBC had that on their front page. But I mean, as a philosopher, what can I tell you? You're in the realm of that gap between thick and thin, or sort of thick and flat facts. And I had a conversation, I think, with somebody on Twitter being really puzzled by what on earth I'm talking about yesterday when I said that, as I've often said on this channel, on the philosophy channel a few times, that facts require evaluative presuppositions, except the flattest facts. So, if we try to uncontroversially describe what's happening in Ukraine by only using the flattest facts, we would say that there's a military conflict in Eastern Europe. I mean, even if we say there are two armies fighting in Eastern Europe, somebody could contradict that. For instance, by, I don't know, pointing out the feudalistic nature of the Russian military, which means that it can't be entirely thought of as a single unit, whatever. Somebody will find a way to challenge a presumption there. So a question like whether something is a retaliatory strike or not is, I would say, maybe not even a matter of fact at all. Maybe it's just an evaluation and interpretation with some factual elements in it. Or it's a very rich matter of fact. It's a fact that requires a lot of evaluation and a lot of interpretation. It's certainly not a flat fact. Just in terms of sincerity, there'll be people who argue that it wasn't retaliatory, and there'd be people who argue that it was. However, what's really important is that just because something is a matter of evaluation doesn't mean it's subjective or relative. There will be evaluations that are superior or more truthful than others. So you've got a couple of pence of a philosopher's, 2 cents of a philosopher's answer. Essay, Stigma. Stigma has a negative connotation, but it somehow is human in that, in some cases, for example, the risk of being infected with some kind of disease, um, it can serve a function. What is a good balance? So you could be talking about, well, let's say what kind of thing we're talking about. We're talking about prejudice that has a derogatory dimension. It's to do with things like things like a degrading thing, a shameful thing, and so on. So in the modern world, I think stigma about illness is more likely to come at the level of images rather than at the level of beliefs. We tend to not believe that people's illnesses are their fault and so on and so forth. But in the past, it wasn't so. In the past, stigma would have been more a product of beliefs than it is today. And today it's more a product of images. So I think a very blunt kind of answer would be that the best balance would be to have the least amount of it possible, because you're talking about a prejudice. I don't see how you can think of stigma in terms of something that isn't a prejudicial point of view. And therefore, being prejudicial, it contains error. Now, if you wanted to talk about two things, something in evolutionary psychology about avoiding bad things happening to you, or about something rational, it's just an elementary feature of human motivation that, even before there's much of a society, the earliest humans would have had the thought, I don't want bad stuff happening to me. I don't want things I don't want happening to me. And what you've got to be careful with that is that these derogatory attitudes about illness are going to be enormously culturally inflected. So the idea that you could have some kind of cultural unit that's stigma, that you recognize to be the same in Athens 2000 years ago as it is in Berlin in 2024, that's probably a stretch. But some kind of attitudes of aversion to illness that take very different shapes under different cultural circumstances, you could perhaps get away with describing at an evolutionary level. But here we would want to delve into the literature. We would also want to delve into the sociology of prejudice about illness. And on that, I'm not, really an expert. But I do think that there is, I'm not an academic expert on that. I'm a bit of an expert in my biography on that because I think about illnesses a lot. What else are you asking? Yes, you're talking about a balance. Yeah. Psychoanalytically, there's certainly a tendency to find, illness ugly. And when we find something ugly, that is a constellation of two kinds of fear. One is fear of the unknown, and the other is fear of death. And so you can have a conversation about aversion at an evolutionary level, at the rational level, and at a psychoanalytic level, and they're all connected. But I think that I'm struggling to think of a particular case of prejudice about illness in which I would want that prejudice to persist without being reduced to some degree. What I do recognize is that prejudice about illness is going to be a ubiquitous feature of human life. I don't think it's something you can eliminate, precisely because of some of the mechanisms we just gestured at. But I mean, let me put it very bluntly. I mean, you're talking about contagious conditions, I suppose. But let's jump off that for a moment, and I'll see if I have anything to say about contagious conditions. I think that if I develop significant mental health issues, for example, while engaging in this conversation with you over a period of years, a lot of you would feel deeper empathy with me. I mean, you feel deeper empathy with me because I have physical illness, but if I had a mental health challenge, you'd also you'd feel deeper empathy with me on top of whatever you feel. But with some of you to some extent, or with most of you to a tiny extent, I would lose a little bit of credibility. And that's not because you'd have beliefs like, oh, people with mental health challenges should get less credibility, but certainly the generosity and clarity and stability and externality which I present would be a bit undermined by that in your experience. And that might lead you to question some good things I say, which you, knowing that my mental health is excellent, won't question. So in that direction, I'd want to say we don't want that to happen, because we want to not just understand what people are going through, but we want to have, if you like, the interpretive resources out there in society that make it easier rather than harder for people to be understood. I think that with contagious illnesses, the question is, how prevalent are they and how destructive are they? Because I could also see some circumstances in which a fairly prevalent and moderately destructive illness was not just not greeted with aversion, but was being ignored for various kinds of cultural circumstances. So culture can inflect this quite a bit. But I think if you're presenting me with a case of some kind of deadly pandemic where literally we have a majority mortality rate, then some of these mechanisms that we've talked about, these mechanisms of aversion, would certainly kick in. Now, let's have another look. You feeling that I'm slower today? But you're with me, so we're doing good. Let's have a look. There's a few comments, a couple of comments on nuclear deterrence. Um, Nuclear deterrence is a thing, but nuclear deterrence is compatible with nuclear powers receiving attacks that do not existentially threaten them. Les is wishing me health. Charlotte is in Denmark. Charlotte is in Denmark. Salman is complaining that his comments are insta-deleted on YouTube. I am truly sorry about that. We've got a minority of comments that indeed seem to be disappearing. John Hughes, I wonder if I'm going to go there. John Hughes is asking, how do we exercise hyper-identity politics from our societies? We don't. You don't exercise cultural moments of moment. They come and go. You can inflect them a bit. But one of the problems with any kind of pattern that is counterproductive that we're running is that it's not entirely possible to talk about it in terms of us and them. Well, they, the 30% of the population, are doing it, and we, the 70%, are completely free of this, and they are the bad people. Very often, when you look more deeply, there are various forces that are acting on all of us, and then we happen to respond to them in different ways. My social analysis of what I call hyper-identity politics is pessimistic. That's to say that there is a really dangerous anti-democratic authoritarian backlash against it that is only in its beginning stages. So the UK philosopher John Gray tends to think that identity politics will consolidate its hold over institutions. I mean, hyper identity politics. There are different kinds of identity politics. I tend to not think that. I tend to think it's going to get washed away, and not in a good way. In other words, the wave coming against it, in my assessment, may well be worse than the thing itself. For democracy, so it's a very difficult thing to even talk about, because the people who are vehemently against it are doing something very destructive and often aren't constructively critical of it, and the people who are practicing it dramatically are caught up in the middle of it, caught up in what I would call the theatrics of it. And then there is a lot of progressively tending people who do not see it. And I think that is the predicament of perhaps half of the beautiful community, if not the majority of the beautiful community. You just don't know what on earth I'm talking about when I'm talking about this. So this is a really sort of interesting challenge for me in my capacity as a public intellectual, because I'm not just here to tell the truth. I'm here to say things that are going to be constructive and helpful, and that need to be answerable always to a question, Vlad, who is this for? Right? And here I have a problem, which is it's not clear who I'm able to address with these remarks, except just by keeping saying them because they're true. One way in is to talk about it very piecemeal. So, for instance, talk about either particular institutions or particular bits of society being on the wrong end of dramatic identity politics. And I will produce something off YouTube on the climate movement and hyper identity politics. And the effect of of hyper identity movement, of hyper identity politics in the climate movement, has been to first of all bring about the self-immolation of some movements because they've eaten themselves up via conflicting about identity issues. But in other cases, just made them exclusive. It's created situations where you can join us if you subscribe to B, but also to C and to D. And if you want to join us because you agree with A on us, no, you have to agree on B and C and D. And so they've had a kind of mobilization problem. So that's a limited case in which I will be talking about it of YouTube. Now, there are some features of identity politics that are just a reflection of where we are as a culture, and these affect most people in society, not just, if you like, people who go in for hyper identity politics. And a good example of this is the way we moralize and center in our identity our political views. And what I want to say is that we have a situation where increasingly a majority of people in Western societies are doing it. This happens to everybody, people who do not practice hyper identity politics and people who do. But you see, I will just pointed out an element of it that is actually universal across our society. Um, if you listen to a public talk by, let us say, a philosopher in 1984 about politics, and then there is questions, but they're questions from the general public. So we're not talking about an academic seminar. The questions will often be, so you said this, I don't quite follow what you have in mind. Can you just say more about that? You made this remark. I'm not getting it. Can you explain it a bit differently, maybe? Today, in such an event, many of the questions will be, why would you say such a thing? Right? Now, this kind of identitarian moralization is a universal feature of our society. Then there are some more particular practices that then make one closer to being a practitioner of hyper-identity politics. One is wanting institutions to not be neutral on particular conflicts in the culture that society disagrees about. But instead of allowing these conflicts to go on, you want institutions to legislate on them. So, for instance, you want your university to take a stance on contemporary theories of decolonization because you find some theories of decolonization or some criticisms of theories of decolonization racist, and you don't want your university institutionally being neutral on that. And yeah, I mean that stuff is happening. And so that is, I think, something. If you're wanting this, if you're sort of fighting for that kind of institutional capture to suit your political enterprise, that's certainly a feature of it. But then other features are to do with forms of political depoliticization, which are again things that affect all of us, practitioners of identity politics and not. So, um, and of course, there are psychological accounts here, like what is happening in the mind of that person who has stood up and said at the public event, "Why would you say such a thing?" That's a sort of extraordinary form of de-individuation of the person who they're interacting with. So we've got to have a healthy balance between telling people who are doing stuff that's counterproductive, "Hey guys, you're doing stuff that's out of order," but we've also got to be aware that there's very little that can be entirely captured in an us versus them, dynamic. Um, that's why, for example, some of the um, right culture war attempts to obliterate postmodernist influences in contemporary culture are absurd, because these are influences that in a way are simply swimming about there, and if you swat them here they'll just appear over there. So an us and them approach to, knocking out from our cultural practice and from our politics the increasingly pervasive thought, for instance, that thinking it makes it so. That whatever I think about X will just be true of it, right? That kind of extraordinary relativism that is quite pervasive. Um, well, you can't knock it out by declaring a culture war on it, right? So that's the infinitesimal set of remarks. But we've got to balance telling people, yo, you're out of order, with not treating cultural deformations as things that are simply the fault of some people 100%, but not at all the fault of others who are simply innocent, you know, um, and standing on the side. Sam, thank you. Let's have a look. Rochester saying if Trump wins, he at least hopes that the Brits will keep him from going crazy with foreign policy. Um, the consensus in the UK that Boris Johnson, who is a sort of British version of Trump, cannot return to power is mistaken. So we could have a Trump here too. They do have differences. I mean, they are different, but they're both, I would say, wreckers of democratic ritual and democratic process. Surf Noosa, good morning from sunny Brisbane. I haven't been to Noosa for a long time. Haven't been to Brisbane since 2007, when I was round about there for a few days on the way to Vanuatu. Yeah, Rochester, I know you're not a Trump supporter. Well, my story about Trump, and that is that he is horrendously debilitated at the level of forming an effective elite to implement his anti-democratic enterprises. So that's one good thing about him. He's not an Orban or a Putin skill-wise, but he will try to learn the lessons from his first term if he wins. I still think there's at least a coin toss chance of that, if not more, that he's going to win. But he'll try to learn from his um, failure of co-option. I mean, Trump feels he rather got co-opted by various forces, political forces, and so he'll try to avoid that. One of the very few good things going for us is that his talent for that is not extraordinary. As is saying, there were stories about Trump falling asleep in court. Yes, I just read the reports. I didn't see if that would be confirmed or not. Comrade Champ, I will talk about identity politics more, and I'll even talk about trans rights. But I've done enough on that, I think, for today. I mean, it's very important that well, let me say something very important about rights briefly. That'll be not the question you're asking, but you'll run into this issue if you ask questions of that kind about really any groups in society. We all swim in rights discourse, whether we like it or not. And even really reluctant people in that soup are still going to use those terms. And we also swim in human rights discourse. And we swim in human rights discourse in a very gooey way, I must say. And I want to talk about this systematically because I think that there's a certain way in which human rights discourse is eating itself up. And I have some empathy for that, but also limited empathy for that. The empathy I have is that if I check with a few of my friends who work in the charity sector, my closest friend is a CEO in the charity sector. The tendency is that if an issue is important and you throw the human rights tag onto it, it might help 1%. So why not do it? The question is, does that not cumulatively degrade the efficacy of human rights discourse? But one thing I'd say is that there's a big difference between calling something a right and calling something a human right. And let me bring out just two features of that difference. Rights clash with each other, and then you need politics to arbitrate them. If I have a right, I have something that is more than just a want. I have a legitimate and serious political claim that something ought to be done or ought to not be done. So if I have a right, it's not just me saying, here is a desire of mine I'd like actualized. No, it's more. I actually have a claim in terms of a political value or in terms of a political concern that is recognized and should be recognized in society. But nevertheless, that still can clash with other concerns and other people's rights. So rights necessarily clash with other rights. You're not going to think up of any right that won't clash with other rights and other important political claims. That's not true of human rights. Human rights do not clash with other human rights, and human rights do not clash with rights, and they do not clash with other claims. So there's a kind of a special cleanness about human rights. That's one feature I want to bring out. Another feature I'd bring out is that human rights have to come with an extraordinarily clear account of agency about who has the corresponding obligations. That's to say, if I say I have a human right that's being violated, that should really mean in the practical world is that somebody is doing something very bad that they should desist from. That's it. If meeting my human rights needs requires such a complex agency driven response, who's going to do who, what, and how, and when, and by what mechanisms, if that picture of agency is terribly complex, it's not a human right. A human right is literally somebody is about to do something very bad, somebody with political power, and they should not do it. They must desist from doing so. There's a kind of the obligations with human rights are negative. The obligations with rights are not always negative at all, and they're often very complex. I might have a right with quite challengingly difficult corresponding obligations. We could debate about that. So these are two differences that I'd bring out for now. But I just feel I talked for 10 minutes about ID politics, and that's enough for that's enough for today. Um, the, there are difficulties talking about this topic, and so when we talk about it, we're also going to talk about ongoing the difficulties of talking about it, and that will in itself help us make sense of make sense of these things. But quite certainly, what is missing is a sufficiently constructive, um, and I don't use that word but myself, but effectively it's true, progressive criticism of certain hyperidentity politics patterns. Um, in other words, we want critiques there of people who understand the deep challenges of racism, other, constitutively disadvantaged um, forms of deprioritization and exclusion of groups. I mean, you are raising. Trump wants to be like Bojo in terms of coming from old money and family prestige. You're raising a very interesting question, Rachel, about the psychology that a lot of these authoritarian populist political candidates share, not just with themselves, but even partly with somebody like Putin. And no, it's absurd to say that Trump and Putin are the same political phenomena, but these psychological overlaps are interesting, are important. SIP3 is asking, is Kremlin reaching to depoliticize us, or is this happening by accident? Well, it's an historical tendency that we're in the middle of. But the question arises, what's the influence of the Kremlin here? And the danger is that we get this wrong by thinking that they're not trying to interfere, which would be wrong, or by thinking that they're making a huge difference. I mean, one of the most self-harming things we can do is assume that our problems are caused by the Kremlin in domestic politics, because they're overwhelmingly not. If you listen to experts about sort of various kinds of active measures and forms of interference by the Kremlin in our politics, whether that be in France, Germany, UK, or the USA, wherever, in Central Europe and other countries in Central Europe, what the experts tend to emphasize for us epistemically is not to confuse Russian activity with efficacy. It doesn't follow from the fact that the Russians are trying lots of stuff and doing lots of things or flooding various bits of the internet in various ways. It doesn't follow from that that that's effective. So there needs to be an efficacy analysis, and we shouldn't just sort of scare ourselves by looking at the scale of these enterprises and conclude from that that thereby they are having an enormous influence on us. As far as the US election, which we will talk about, and the Russian strategy for the US election goes, I do recognize and I recommend us to assume that there is a difference. And that is that in 2016, the Russians did not support Trump. They supported disruption, which for them meant supporting Trump to make Hillary's victory be compromised. But they didn't think Hillary would lose. So they saw Trump not as the person they were backing, but as a disruptor. Today, they would outrightly favor Trump in the race with Biden, and that is an interesting difference. Sorry about Russian trolls in the house. Likos, Cheryl has asked a question about civilian infrastructure. Oil refineries as civilian infrastructure, question mark. And is that tied with something else you just said a little bit earlier, Cheryl? Is this about the US not wanting Ukraine to attack Russia's oil refineries? Then there is a question about the Baltics. Okay, so yes, the Biden administration is not entirely impressed with Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil refineries. I think partly they think that they're evaluating the economic impact of that, but also partly they think it might be counterproductive or not terribly productive for Ukraine on balance. Ukraine's feeling pretty good about this, and also just in moral terms, striking targets on Russian territories is something that's a moral boost for Ukrainian society. I don't have anything to say about that, except it being part of a story in which the United States is not committed to Ukrainian victory. It's committed to Ukrainian survival, and its commitment is little by little diminishing. And in many ways, the United States is finding the impossibility of solving this conflict really difficult. The United States, the tendency of the Biden administration is to be frustrated by the absence of a suitable solution to the conflict short of a Ukrainian victory. But as a Ukrainian victory isn't the project, I mean, it's a contingency that could occur, but it's not the project. What's the exit game out of this? So there's a sort of a tension between trying to end and de-escalate this and the realization that there isn't a sustainable way out, and so this is where things are stuck. And as I say, my analysis of the obstance here is that it's an absence of strategy secondary to democratic incapacity. So that's more constitutive than simply particular people not liking or not wanting certain things. Willpower matters, but it's not primarily a matter of willpower. Joe Biden does not want Putin to be stealing large chunks of Ukrainian territory, just like Biden does not want Israel to be pulverizing Gaza. But Israel is pulverizing Gaza, and Putin is stealing large parts of Ukrainian territory, bombing civilian targets in Ukraine, and so on. So we're back to this conversation of a great power, little by little, in a sort of uneven pattern, withdrawing from its commitments in the world. So this is a conversation we're going to have over and over and over and over and over in relation to so many issues about what the West gives, what the West doesn't give, how quickly it gives, how quickly it doesn't give, and what it's happy, what it's not happy for Ukraine to do. Some of the weapons Ukraine has got, it is free to use in any way. For instance, some of its weapons it's not free to use in any way. some of Ukraine's conduct on Russian territory is approved of by some of its supporters, but disapproved of by others, and others are in the, sort of in the grey area. Blah 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 blah. But we're in this wash that is defined by an absence of a strategy, an incapacity, a democratic incapacity to fix that absence, and at the same time, a desire to exit the situation without an exit being available for the United States. Rachel is asking about Jodi Dean's article and later removal of teaching duties. I haven't read it. People I trust have said that it was offensive, but now there are legal experts who could also comment on this, but my position is very clear. If an academic does not threaten violence, very roughly speaking, you do not remove them from their teaching duties. They might have all kinds of appalling views. Um, Pick your topic, but as long as they're not threatening violence, and what we understand as threatening violence very often on campuses today is absurd. Um, because speech very, 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 very rarely should be taken to be linked with violence. We're really needing very serious threats. I mean, let me give you an example. So I'm ill with ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, for 20 years. And today, my talking to you is the first time I'm up during the day. My functioning is limited. My suffering is high. I'm not affiliated with an institution right now, but if I were, and somebody was coming onto campus and they were going to tell scientific lies, scientifically untrue things about my condition. Let's say they were going to say, "Oh, it's not real." Well, it's debatable, but let's say since about 94, 95 or so, it's been proven that my condition is real, scientifically, in my judgment. But that person should not be deplatformed. Or if an academic at my university is saying scientifically false things, I don't necessarily think they should be deplatformed. Depends what kind of false things, but there are many false things they can say that are a matter of scientific fact, I would argue. Facts can be a bit evaluative, though, of course, which I would want them to be able to say, and I certainly would want to protect racist and homophobic speech on campuses, speech that would you know make me feel very deeply offended and would make me want to stand up and say, shut up and stop this ignorant, prejudicial nonsense. But that's what I'd do. I'd just stand up and say that. I'd say, what a disgrace, what a racist disgrace you are. But I wouldn't deplatform them, nor would I remove them from their position necessarily. So what I'm saying is we've got to be extremely moderate about that move from condemning somebody's speech to relieving them of their teaching duties or deplatforming them. And they've got to be extremely conservative about violence. I was doing a talk a few years ago, and somebody put up their hand and said that the way the banking system worked in Britain and the various ways that it was difficult to access and work with for the most disadvantaged people was a form of violence. And I just don't support that. I know I'm not speaking about the particular piece, but the same distinctions hold. So, for instance, I'm a huge fan of the idea that there's a lot of disadvantage that is really constitutive. It's very deep, very entrenched, very deep kinds of exclusion that, you know, especially if you listen to a lot of American self-help videos, you're not going to understand because they're going to say, well, it's individual responsibility. You've got to dig your way out. So I'm very comfortable with that idea, but I'm extremely uncomfortable in academic context, which I've encountered many times, of course, in which people just call systemic disadvantaged violence. Hmm. Well, I mean, look, um, I wouldn't be ill if a couple of billion were pumped into fixing my condition over the last 30 years. So, am I experiencing violent physical symptoms as a result of this? Not just lack of funding, but obstruction of funding by various kinds of unlovely interests. No, I'm just completely uncomfortable to describe what is the disadvantage that I've experienced as a form of violence. So I'm I'm really worried when people threaten violence, and then I talk about deplatforming and relieving of teaching duties. But profoundly offensive or immoral things, no, because you've got to have this basic element of contestation, and we have a problem with it. We have people constantly freaking out when academic contestation occurs, and that's really not okay. Collective West is saying human rights can clash. Um, when I talk about concepts like um, human rights or genocide, I do not rely on the expression of them in the post World War II jurisprudential revolution in international norms. In other words, you can't take genocide convention and say that's what genocide is. Genocide is a concept. It needs to be constructed. It's irrelevant um, for the purposes of the question of whether something constitutes a genocide or not. What various international um, documents say and agreements say. It may be that they mislabel what's going on, but because they still operate with those unfortunate labels that we're going to have to deal with that reality. But it doesn't mean you could just take what was, if you like, written up by that um, post World War II revolution and just use these concepts. So one of the problems we've got is we've got a lot of um, uh, positive rights that have no account of corresponding obligations labeled as human rights. But you can't have a human right to employment. You can't. You can have a right to it, but you can't have a human right to it, and so on and so forth. Um, so I'm not directly answering your question, but what I'm saying that's really, I think, significant is a concept like human rights or genocide or indeed even ethnic cleansing needs to be constructed. It's not just given, and you can't just take it from various norms that have got established because they are just examples of the construction of that concept, but it could be that they're constructed completely unusably and impractically. So you can never sort of say, oh, my conception of human rights is right because it mirrors these international um, documents. No, you have to You have to, if you like, construct the concept afresh when you're talking about it. You can't rely on anything like that. So, Hein is saying Russia is defending its citizens in Ukraine. Well, you know what? Putin doesn't even think that. So that's kind of an over-egging of even Kremlin propaganda. Well, the Kremlin would say that, but they don't think that. Norman, thank you. Yeah, I mean, Cheryl, we've got a huge crisis of the irresponsibles in conservative and right parties. We've talked a little bit about irresponsibles in centrist parties with hyper-identity politics, but we've got the irresponsibles in conservative parties who are in many ways ceasing to be conservatives, are becoming kind of revolutionaries who want to smash various bits of our democratic process, our democratic ritual. So Lampredi is saying, I was reading Quentin Skinner's critique of Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of liberty. Skinner thinks Berlin has a poor sense of negative liberty derived from Hobbes that misses the freedom of non-domination. Any thoughts? Now, this is really a question for the Philosophy Channel. I'll say something very brief about it. I've been in plenty of rooms where Quentin Skinner himself has expressed that view. And Quentin Skinner is personally frustrated by the fame and legacy of Isaiah's paper Two Concepts of Liberty. I can't tell you what that distinction is in 2 minutes flat because it's not an analytical distinction. But basically, what Isaiah wants to do with the concept of negative liberty isn't the Hobbesian enterprise Quentin thinks Isaiah is after. But to Quentin's credit, if you read Isaiah's paper just as an academic essay, then you can see how that looks like that's what it is on the page. But it's not an academic essay. It's a public intellectual intervention, really. And it should be read like a non-academic piece. And you should give because if you read it as an academic piece, you shouldn't analyze it at all. You might as well just give up on it. It contains plenty of contradictions, internal contradictions indeed. That's not a fault in quite the same it would be way it would be if it were an academic paper. So in a nutshell, the point of negative liberty is that it is a conception of liberty that is minimally reliant on normative and evaluative supplements. I'm losing everybody now. I'm only going to go on for 1 or 2 minutes about this. So it's a special conception of liberty for a highly self-conscious and reflective and somewhat disenchanted modern society. It's a completely historical proposal, and it's not an analytical distinction at all. Now, what Quentin is then saying, if you detach what he's saying from a specific critique of the Isaiah Berlin paper, is that there is another sense of freedom that we need to think about on top of all the other senses that we might have encountered. Isaiah Berlin once said there were 200. That's an exaggeration historically, but there were many. But what Quentin Skinner is pushing is indeed a conception of freedom that we might want to recognize as part of the legacy of Western culture. We might want to say, having admitted we're stuck with it, then whether it's a good thing we're stuck with it, whether we want to go deeper into it or further out from it. And Quentin would say we go more deeper into it, and Isaiah might say, "I'm not sure." Um, but is the conception Quentin picking out real? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example of it. Um, you know, somebody having power over you that they're not using, but that they have. Um, so they're not putting any obstacles in your way, but they could. So what's an example of it? This. So we are allowing, we're being allowed to have the 1 hour, 15-minute conversation we've had today. But who controls this stuff? Is it you and me? No. Is it a government we voted for? No. So what if YouTube, which is a very important public square platform, came along tomorrow and said, you know what? There are these 7 words you're not allowed to mention. Isaiah Berlin, Gaza, Trump, veganism, coffee. Well, will we be able to stop that? Would we be able to vote for somebody who would stop that? No. So that's an example of being in the power of somebody who has the power over you but isn't using it. And that's a very important political concern that is a feature of Quentin's idea of non-domination, the conception of liberty is pushing. Okay, I've really lost everybody here, so I'm incredibly grateful that you've tolerated this deviation. I'm going to do a political philosophy and a moral philosophy Q&A at some point on the Small Philosophy channel, which will allow us to dig more deeply into this. If we successfully protect our power, I was asking our democracies during this time of crisis, what would healing our democracies look like? They can't heal fully for the foreseeable future under conditions that obtain. The social forces in the world today are not compatible with flourishing democracies being all over the place. So we can always do better, but it's not like we were good in the 90s and now we've fallen off, we need to climb back there. That was an historical aberration, that period. It was a strangely optimistic period. There's a lot to criticize about things that are always wrong in our societies and always unjust in our societies and so on. But in relative terms, this was a somewhat rosy period that was historically atypical. So the idea that that's normal, we've got to return to it, is a certain kind of special confusion. It's a conflation of the idea that the future will be like the past, which is probably right, with the wrong idea that the future will be like the recent past, which it won't. But there's much we can do. So even with everything we've discussed today, we can do better. We can, for instance, have, even while suffering from democratic incapacity, more of a global strategy and more of a global joined up approach to how we think about the various crises we're dealing with. Instead of piecemeal crisis management, which is often what we're getting. We could have the profession of journalism. I'm just going to hit a few of the points I happen to have made during the talk today. We could have journalists doing a much better job of picking out anti-democratic conduct and anti-democratic candidates for political office. At the moment, we really struggle with this. And I must say, I get frustrated with the journalistic profession because they talk about our democratic decline as though they're agnostic about it, as though it's happening maybe, but maybe it's not, and who knows, it could be different tomorrow. And they talk about anti-democratic politicians as though they're agnostic about the pattern of whether there are, for instance, conservatives who are ceasing to be conservatives and becoming anti-democratic revolutionaries. And so I'm agnostic about the pattern. And so if I have a politician like Boris Johnson, who is showing all the signs of being an anti-democratic politician, I'm going to talk about him just like I would about John Major, because I don't know if this pattern is really true. Um, and therefore, I don't know how to judge if somebody is a victim of it. And they might have sort of fallen off the path of minimal commitment to democratic institutions. They might be lying in the ditch, but journalistic talk goes on as though they might still be sort of walking along that path, where in fact they've fallen off, they're in the ditch. In fact, they're enjoying being in the ditch, they're exploiting the benefits of being in the ditch, and so on. And so there is this kind of problem about calling out anti-democratic politicians, which expresses itself in journalists who work for major publications at dinner parties absolutely being able to call it out in 2 seconds flat, but not knowing how to do it in a professional context and not knowing how to align the institutions they work for with the capacity to call it out, right? We've talked about one of the deformations that I think are significant, which I call hyperidentity politics. We can explain to people what's challenging about it, do better from that point of view. Um, Above all, though, what we're trying to do is make people feel like they can touch politics. Make people feel that politics is neither opaque nor unreachable. And, that's something that's not just a matter of culture, it's also a matter of policy and institutions and institutional evolution. For instance, the use of new democratic devices that complement what we have, don't abolish it, complement what we have, like citizens' assemblies, a proposal of which, in principle, I'm terribly fond of. So you're asking me really, Paolo, a question about democratic regeneration, and it is something we'll talk about more, but this is just a snippet. Only Facts is again asking me about connections between conflicts. I think that we do not want to miss the point that as much as Russia and China like and don't like each other, that they are engaged in a partly shared enterprise of disrupting whatever is left, destroying whatever is left of the international order. And we've got to recognize that. So it's unconstructive to think about conflicts completely apart. Let's point out something else. US incapacity for strategy or for constraint of Israel has absolutely had a terrible deleterious effect on the Ukraine war in several respects. Even in a democratic respect, in the sense that Western citizens are less impressed with arguments about the strategic significance of Ukraine and the aversion of the suffering and destruction that Ukraine's experiencing in the context of the conversation that's occurred about Gaza that's often evasive about the degree of devastation that Israel has generated there. So everything is connected. And absolutely, this is, I don't need to tell you this. People who are more directly experts about international affairs can tell you that, of course, weakness in the obstruction of Putin's enterprise in Ukraine is going to have impact on what the Chinese might do in the years to come. And our problem is that we are struggling to generate a public discourse, and I empathize with politicians, it's hard, that strategically connects all of the global challenges we face. And this is hard because it's not, this just isn't only about making connections. It's also about making proposals, global proposals, that are going to reimagine the way things are going. And that are also responsive to people's concerns all over the world and people's suspicion and detestation of US power too. Why do so many people hate America? Why do so many people dislike the West? Is it just because they're delusional, or maybe there is substance to it, and it's a product of certain, global arrangements that we need to handle differently in the future? We would be able to handle differently in the future if we had the capacity to create a new strategy. Blah blah blah. Thank you, Tony. Well, let's begin winding down because you've already suffered enough of me. Oh, now I am seeing more super chat. Let me have a quick look about this. What I think about the fate of the Baltic states. Conradus is asking. I'm not an alarmist, but I think that the idea of Putin challenging Article 5 is something that is on balance unlikely to happen, but for contingent historical reasons. That's to say that I do view Putin's regime security derived, but not just regime security derived, co-option into foreign escalation as being a real thing. And so I'm not like some analysts who say, look, I don't see why this could ever go beyond Ukraine. I'm not an alarmist about it going beyond Ukraine, but yeah, I mean, there is even a video on the main channel from about 2020. It's called Thinking About the Mind of Putin or whatever, where I talk about the prospect of the Baltic states being invaded. And I still think that that's an interesting thought in the sense that an evil advisor to Putin would have said, don't invade Ukraine, invade the Baltic states, but later, not in 2022, but later in the 2020s. But to clarify this, Putin is not going to be wanting a full-scale war. Putin will only want to escalate further if he thinks that there's a high degree of confidence available to him that Article 5 will not work. So when people talk about Putin wanting a full-scale war with NATO, he doesn't. He precisely wants to avoid that war and wants to, if you like, dissolve NATO by prodding it. So he only wants a conflict with NATO if it will not lead to a full-scale war. Whether a situation arises that escalates, of course, we don't know. David is asking about various Russian enterprises of destabilization. The key answer is that we should respond by, in the constructive sense, destabilizing the Russian space, by politicizing the Russian space, by generating conflict on the Russian space. So this is one of these conversations that I think is constructive. Um, you know, what can we do to them that they're doing to us, while not wanting to do to them everything they're doing to us, because some of the things they're doing we don't want to do. So on top of a piecemeal answer about how to deal with Russian involvement here or there, Russian interference here or there, and various strategic considerations about how to keep certain countries on a firmer footing from sliding into Russian influence. On top of that, there is this basic conversation of us politicizing the Russian space, something that is extravagantly absent and actually doesn't require enormous resources, but it requires a bit of strategic thinking. Interestingly, I think politicizing the Russian space is something that is easier to do while lacking the democratic capacity for a fully fledged strategy, but we're still not doing it. Do you think the current events eerily mirror the 20s or the 30s, Astro Guy? There is a smell of the 30s in the air a little bit. But we shouldn't overstate it. Because, for instance, the decline of Western democracies is not going to end up with us sliding into what happened to Germany. It's just not at all going to end up it going in that direction. But it will end up going, in some cases, very plausibly, into a sort of undemocratic authoritarian direction. So, and if you go back to identity politics, what I call hyper identity politics, one of the destructive side effects of it over the next 20 years will be that it would have contributed to the reemergence of a white identitarian politics, which is going to come back big time in European politics, I'm afraid. And that's awful. And that does have a bit of a smell of the 30s. But no, we're not. We're not going to uh, repeat what historically happened then. But are there some unlovely parallels? Sure. Michu is asking how difficult of a problem is it to call everybody who disagrees with certain policies a Russian asset? It depends. There's a plural informational environment. So if you're trying to pump up your gang and motivate them, you could go around calling people Russian assets. It has its harms, but you could do it. So plenty of people who have activist content for Ukraine do it. And to be honest, I don't wince too much about that. But does it carry harms? Yeah, sure. It's the harm of polarization. It's the harm of inviting an enemy relation, instead of an oppositional relation in a democracy, and a relation of evil. You begin to think of your opponents as evil, because if I'm in Britain, or if I'm in the United States and somebody's positively working for the Kremlin while being in my political establishment, that's evil. That's terrible. So, you know, I, I am especially slow to go in that direction. I recommend against it, in particular because I know all of you guys are watching content um, which pushes you toward that. So I have to be a slight compensating effect. But yes, I think every time you're in doubt about whether to call somebody a Russian asset, don't. But if you're going to do it, I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to stop you. And I know a lot of you do it. But I would not call anybody a Russian asset unless they were literally working for the Kremlin. And I think that's healthy. But I'm not going to be able to constrain everybody's usage. But if I tilt you anywhere, it's against that. Yes. I think we've done it. We've done it. Beautiful community. Thank you very much, everybody. Lovely of you to have tolerated me on my slower form today. I look forward to being connected on the main channel and here over the weeks to come. And if my health is worse, or if I'm doing medical procedures that take me away from the channels, I always update on the community wall, on the community tab on both channels about that. So also, if you're on social media platforms that are not YouTube, find me there and follow me. If you're on Instagram, find me on Instagram and follow me there. If you are on Twitter, on X, whatever it is now, but you don't follow me, find me and follow me there. If there's a break in content, I'm always going to make announcements all over the place. Thank you. Lots of love, and talk soon.